My father-in-law offered me a job cleaning his toilets. He thought he was saving me from poverty. He didn't know I owned 45% of his company. He didn't know I could buy his entire life with my quarterly dividends. But I took the job. I took the mop. And then I took his empire. Before I tell you how I destroyed him, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated. The hydraulic press hissed, stamping out another sheet of aerospace-grade aluminum with a deafening crunch. To anyone else on the factory floor, I was just Mason, the guy on line 4, who kept to himself, hit his quotas, and ate his sandwich alone in the break room. To me, this wasn't just a job. It was due diligence. I ran my gloved hand over the finished part, feeling a sharp burr on the edge. Sloppy. That was the third defect this hour. Sterling Dynamics was cutting corners on quality control, and I was the only shareholder who knew it, because I was the only one wearing a blue collar. My phone vibrated against my ribs, buzzing with an persistence that ignored the factory noise. I wiped the grease on my coveralls and checked the screen. Richard Sterling. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the sheer effort it took not to scream. Dinner. Tonight. 7 sharp. Don't be late, Mason. And for God's sake, try to look presentable. We have a guest. He hung up before I could answer. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. I clocked out and walked to the employee parking lot. There she was, my 2005 Ford F-150. The paint was peeling, the bumper was held on by hope, and the engine sounded like a smoker's cough, but I wouldn't trade it for a fleet of Ferraris. This truck was the last thing my father left me before he died of overwork, trying to pay off debts he didn't owe. It was my anchor. It reminded me that money is just paper, but resilience is iron. I picked up Vanessa at her office. She slid into the passenger seat, carefully pulling her cream designer skirt away from the center console as if the upholstery might bite her. She didn't kiss me hello. She just wrinkled her nose. Mason, really. You know my parents hate this truck. It smells like oil and old sweat. Couldn't you have rented something? Or at least washed it? I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to tell her that this truck had more integrity than her father's entire board of directors. I wanted to tell her that the oil stain on my shirt was worth more than her shoes. But I stayed silent. I was playing the long game, and I couldn't fold my hand yet. I just needed to get from point A to point B. Ness, I said quietly. She sighed, looking out the window, refusing to look at me. That is your problem, Mason. You are always just trying to get by. You have no ambition. Ambition, if she only knew. We pulled up to the Sterling estate 20 minutes later. Wrought iron gates, manicured hedges that cost more than a teacher's salary, and a driveway paved with imported stone. I pulled my truck up to the main gate right behind a sleek silver Porsche that screamed new money. The security guard stepped out of his booth. He looked at the Porsche and waved it through with a respectful salute. Then he looked at me. He saw the rust on my fender. He saw my work boots. He saw a nobody. Service entrance is around back, pal, he barked, not even opening the gate. Deliveries and maintenance use the side door. Vanessa turned bright red. She rolled down the window. George, it is us. It is Mason, my husband. The guard squinted, looking skeptical. Oh, sorry, Miss Sterling. I didn't recognize him. He looks, well, never mind. Go on through. I drove up the long driveway, my jaw set so hard my teeth ached. As we approached the main house, I looked up at the balcony. Richard was standing there holding a crystal glass of scotch. He was looking right at us. He had seen the guard stop me. He had seen the humiliation, and he hadn't lifted a finger. He just took a sip of his drink and smiled. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel like dirt on his shoe. He had no idea that he was looking at the man who owned 45% of the ground he was standing on. I stepped into the foyer, the heels of my work boots clicking against the imported marble floor like gunshots in a library. The air smelled of lavender and old money, a scent designed to make you feel like you didn't belong. And there he was, Bradford Cole. He was leaning against the mahogany mantel holding a crystal glass of scotch, like he was posing for a magazine cover. He wore a suit that probably cost more than the truck I had parked outside. He saw us come in and flashed a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a shark in Italian wool. Richard was beaming next to him, holding a bottle of wine like it was a holy relic. "Look at this, Mason!" Richard boomed, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "A 1982 Chateau Margaux, $2,000 a bottle. Brad here really knows how to treat a host. He appreciates the finer things, unlike some people who are content with cheap beer." I just nodded, keeping my face blank. "Nice," I said. My voice sounded rough, tired from a day of playing the part I had written for myself. Vanessa squeezed my arm, but it wasn't a squeeze of support. It was a warning. She was silently begging me not to embarrass her, not to say anything that would reveal the oil stains on my soul. We moved to the dining room. The table was set with enough silverware to perform a surgery. I sat next to Vanessa, who was busy smoothing a napkin on her lap, refusing to look at me. Richard sat at the head of the table, of course the king of his little kingdom. He didn't waste any time. "So Brad," he said, cutting into his medium-rare steak with surgical precision. "Tell us about that acquisition. I heard your bank just financed the new Skyline Tower downtown." Brad wiped his mouth daintily with a linen napkin. "Oh, that. It was just a small $50 million loan, Richard. Nothing major. But the commission should cover the down payment on my new yacht." They both laughed. A rich, throaty sound that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of men who thought they owned the world, discussing the price of admission. Then Richard turned his gaze to me. His eyes were cold, assessing like he was looking at a defective part on his assembly line. "And you, Mason, how was the factory today? Did you manage to put all the screws in the right holes? Or did you struggle with the complex task of lifting heavy boxes?" The table went silent. The only sound was the clinking of silver against china. I felt Vanessa stiffen beside me. She didn't defend me. She never did. She just took a sip of her wine, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece. I met Richard's gaze evenly. "Production is up, Richard. The line is moving efficiently." He scoffed, a harsh sound that stripped away any pretense of politeness. "Efficiently. You talk about assembly lines while Brad talks about skylines. That is the difference between labor and leadership, Mason. One builds the future, the other just sweeps up the dust." Then Beatrice chimed in. My mother-in-law's voice was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting. She swirled her wine, looking at me over the rim of her glass with eyes that had measured my worth and found it lacking. "Speaking of efficiency, Mason, do you have your share of the rent this month? Or will Vanessa have to cover for you again? I hate to think of my daughter supporting a grown man. It is quite embarrassing, you know, telling my friends at the club that my son-in-law is a financial burden." I gripped my fork so hard the metal bit into my palm. The pain was grounding. It kept me from reaching across the table. They looked at me with such pity, such disdain. They saw a man struggling to make ends meet, a leech attached to their precious daughter. They didn't see the man who had authorized a $200 million commercial real estate acquisition at 6 a.m. Didn't know that while they were bragging about a $50 million loan, my signature had just moved 4 times that amount, across international borders to secure a portfolio of data centers. I owned the building Brad's bank was headquartered in. I could evict his entire career with a phone call. But I took a deep breath, forcing my muscles to relax. The steak tasted like ash in my mouth, but I swallowed it anyway. "I have it, Beatrice," I said quietly. "You don't have to worry about Vanessa." Richard laughed again, pouring more of the $2,000 wine into Brad's glass while leaving mine empty. Good. Because I have a proposal for you, Mason. A way for you to finally stop being a disappointment. Richard wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, placing it gently on the table, as if he had just finished a masterpiece instead of a steak. The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't just awkward anymore, it was predatory. He leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands over his stomach, and let out a long, theatric sigh. Times are changing, Mason, he said, his voice dropping to a tone of mock concern. The manufacturing sector is taking a hit. I just got the report from the plant manager this afternoon. We have to make cuts. Deep cuts. 20% of the assembly line workforce is being let go effective Monday. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. I didn't blink. I knew the factory numbers better than he did. Production was up 12%. There was no economic reason for layoffs, only greed. He was cutting the workforce to artificially inflate the quarterly earnings for a loan application. I knew this because I had read the unredacted board minutes on my encrypted server 2 hours ago. And unfortunately, he continued, a small, cruel smile playing on his lips. Your name came up on the list. You are being let go, Mason. As of right now, you are unemployed. Vanessa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad, you can't. We have the mortgage, the car payments. Richard held up a hand, silencing her. Now, don't get hysterical. I told you I look out for family. I couldn't let my son-in-law be out on the street. It would look bad for the Sterling name. So I pulled some strings. I called in a favor with HR. He reached under the table and pulled out a thin blue folder. He tossed it across the polished mahogany table. It slid over the surface, knocking into my empty wine glass with a sharp chime before coming to a rest right in front of me. Open it, Richard commanded. I flipped the cover. It wasn't a severance package. It wasn't a transfer to another department. It was an employment contract. Position sanitation engineer. Location Sterling Dynamics headquarters. A janitor. He was offering me a job as a janitor. $35,000 a year, Richard said, beaming, as if he had just handed me the keys to the city. Full benefits after 6 months. You will be responsible for the executive wing. Emptying trash cans, mopping floors, cleaning the restrooms. It is honest work, Mason. It is the best I could do for someone with your limited skill set. The room went dead silent. The humiliation was so thick I could taste it like bile. This was his power play. He wanted to see me on my knees scrubbing his floors while he sat in his leather chair. He wanted to break me completely. I slowly turned my head to look at Vanessa. This was the moment. This was the test. I waited for the outrage. I waited for her to stand up, to throw the contract in his face, to tell him that her husband deserved respect. I needed her to be my partner. I needed her to choose me over the money, over the status, over him. Vanessa stared at the paper. Her eyes were wide with panic. She looked at the salary figure, then at her father, then at me. She didn't look angry. She looked relieved. She reached out and touched my arm, her fingers cold and trembling. Mason, she whispered, you should take it. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Excuse me, I said, my voice barely a rasp. Take the job, she said louder this time. Dad is helping us. The job market is terrible right now, Mason. We can't afford for you to be out of work. 35,000 it is money. We need it. Please, just swallow your pride and sign it. She wasn't looking at me with love. She was looking at me with desperation. She saw a drowning man, and instead of throwing me a rope, she was handing me an anchor. She truly believed this was the best I could do. She truly believed that cleaning her father's toilets was my ceiling. I looked back at Richard. Moon. He was watching us, his eyes glittering with triumph. He had won. He had turned my wife against me. He had reduced me to a beggar at his table. Or so he thought. I looked down at the contract again. The executive wing. Access to the top floor. access to the trash, access to the physical files that never made it to the digital server. He was inviting the wolf right into the henhouse and handing him a key. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice flat and dead. "I appreciate the opportunity. I will be the best janitor you have ever seen." Brad chuckled, a wet, condescending sound that grated against the silence of the dining room. He stretched his legs out under the table, deliberately extending his feet so that his polished Italian loafers caught the light of the chandelier. He looked at me with the amusement of a child watching an insect struggle in a jar. "Just a word of advice," Mason Brad sneered, swirling his scotch. "When you are down there crawling around under the desks, try not to polish my shoes with your face by accident. These are custom leather. I would hate to get the smell of failure on them." Beatrice tittered behind her hand, finding his cruelty delightful. Vanessa didn't laugh, but she didn't stop him either. She just stared at the tablecloth, tracing the pattern with a manicured fingernail, disappearing into the background, as she always did when things got difficult. I looked at Brad's shoes. They were nice. Berluti likely $3,000. I owned the holding company that supplied the leather to the tannery in Tuscany, where that specific grade of calfskin was produced. I could bankrupt the supplier tomorrow and force him to wear canvas sneakers for the rest of his life. But rage is a luxury I couldn't afford yet. Rage makes you sloppy. Rage makes you reveal your hand before the river card is dealt. I didn't flinch. I didn't redden. I simply committed the insult to memory, filing it away in the same mental drawer where I kept the rest of their sins. "Don't worry, Brad," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. "I know exactly what kind of trash needs to be taken out." The double meaning flew right over their heads. They were too drunk on their own arrogance to realize I wasn't talking about the waste paper baskets. My mind was already racing, calculating the angles. Richard thought he was banishing me to the shadows. He thought he was stripping me of my dignity. He was a fool. He was handing me the one thing my billions couldn't buy me from the outside access. As a board member or an investor, I only saw the sanitized reports, the cooked books, the numbers they wanted me to see. But a janitor is invisible. A janitor has the master key to every office. A janitor empties the shredder bins where the real secrets are destroyed. A janitor stands in the corner of the room while the executives discuss their illicit deals because to them the help is just furniture with a pulse. He was inviting the fox into the henhouse and asking him to sweep up the feathers. I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and controlled. The chair scraped against the marble floor, a harsh sound that made Beatrice jump. I reached out and picked up the blue employment folder. It felt light in my hand, flimsy, but I knew it was the heaviest weapon in the room. It was Richard's death warrant signed by his own hand. I looked at Vanessa one last time. I wanted to see if there was any fight left in her, any spark of the woman I thought I had married. But she just looked relieved. She was glad the awkwardness was over. She was glad I had accepted my place at the bottom of the food chain so she could keep her place at the top. I turned my gaze to Richard. He was leaning back, smug satisfaction oozing from his pores. He expected gratitude. He expected me to thank him for the scraps from his table. I locked eyes with him. I didn't smile. I let the mask slip just a fraction of an inch, just enough for him to see the cold, hard steel behind my eyes. I let him see the predator that had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. "I accept the position," I said, my voice low and steady. "Thank you, Dad." The word Dad hung in the air like a curse. It wasn't spoken with affection. It was spoken with the finality of a judge reading a sentence. Richard's smile faltered. For a split second, the color drained from his face. A shiver seemed to run through him, a primal instinct warning him that something was very, very wrong. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time that night, I saw fear. He didn't know why, but he felt the temperature in the room drop. He blinked, trying to shake off the feeling, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I turned and walked out of the dining room, clutching the folder, my footsteps echoing with the promise of a war they didn't even know had begun. The silence in the cab of my truck was heavier than the humid night air outside. The engine rattled and hummed a familiar lullaby that usually calmed me, but tonight it only seemed to amplify the tension radiating from the passenger seat. Vanessa was staring out the window, her arms crossed tight across her chest, her posture rigid. We passed the manicured lawns of her parents' neighborhood and hit the highway before she finally exploded. "You have got to be kidding me, Mason," she snapped, turning to face me. The streetlights flickered across her face, illuminating the anger etched into her features. I kept my eyes on the road. What did I do now? "Ness?" "Don't play dumb," she hissed. "The way you said it." "Thank you, Dad. You made it sound like a threat. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed us. My father just threw you a lifeline. He gave you a job when he didn't have to, when you are literally unqualified for anything else, and you looked at him like he was the one working for you." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. A lifeline. She called cleaning up her father's garbage a lifeline. "He offered me a mop, Vanessa," I said, my voice low. "He humiliated me in front of his friends. He treated me like a charity case because he wanted to see me beg. And you let him." "I didn't let him do anything." She shouted, her voice shrill in the small space. "He is trying to help. Why do you always have to be so proud? You are a factory worker, Mason. You were a factory worker. Now you are unemployed. You don't have the luxury of pride. You should have been grateful. Instead, you were arrogant." Arrogant. That was rich. I pulled the truck over to the shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. I put it in park and turned to look at her. The engine idled roughly beneath us. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "For the first time tonight," I said. She blinked, taken aback by the sudden stop. "What do you love me?" I asked. "Or do you love the idea of your father's approval? Do you love the man sitting next to you, or are you just terrified of losing your status if you stand up for him?" Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. She looked at me, really. Looked at me, and for a second, the anger vanished, replaced by a hollow, terrified confusion. She searched for the right words, the safe words, but she couldn't find them. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. In that silence, a memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was our wedding day 3 years ago. We were standing at the altar. The priest had asked for the rings. I had slid the gold band onto her finger without hesitation, my hands steady, my heart full. But when it was her turn, she had paused. It was only for a second, a hesitation so slight that most people probably missed it. But I saw it. I saw her hand tremble. I saw her glance over my shoulder at her father in the front row, seeking his nod, his permission, before she slid the ring onto my finger. I had ignored it then. I had told myself it was just nerves. I had told myself she was overwhelmed by the emotion of the day. But looking at her now, sitting in the passenger seat of my beat-up truck, unable to tell me she loved me, without calculating the cost, I realized the truth. Our marriage didn't die tonight at the dinner table. It had been dead on arrival. It was a corpse we had been dragging around for 3 years, dressing it up in dinner parties and family obligations, pretending it was alive. I didn't wait for her answer anymore. I didn't need it. Her silence was the loudest thing she had ever said. I put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the road, the distance between us now spanning oceans, even though she was just inches away. The factory floor smelled of ozone and hydraulic fluid, a scent that usually signaled the start of another 12-hour shift. But today the air felt heavier, charged with a static electricity that had nothing to do with the machinery. I swiped my badge at the time clock, but instead of the familiar beep of acceptance, the machine let out a harsh, low error tone. Access denied. Before I could try again, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned to see Miller, the floor foreman. He was a man who had risen to his position not by competence, but by being Richard Sterling's most obedient bulldog. He was flanked by two security guards men I had shared coffee with in the break room just yesterday. Today, they wouldn't meet my eyes. "Clean out your locker," Reed Miller barked, his voice loud enough to carry over the hum of the conveyor belts. "You are done." I looked at him, keeping my face impassive. Richard said the layoffs were effective Monday, Miller. Today is Friday. "This isn't a layoff," Miller sneered, pulling a plastic bag from his pocket. He held it up for the floor to see. Inside were a handful of high-grade aerospace titanium fasteners. "We found these in your gym bag during a random inspection. Grand larceny Mason, stealing company property." The sheer audacity of the lie almost made me laugh. I owned the mine that excavated the ore for that titanium. I owned the foundry that smelted it. Why would I steal a handful of bolts worth $50? But I knew this wasn't about the bolts. This was Richard's insurance policy. "I didn't steal anything, Miller, and you know it," I said calmly. "Tell it to the unemployment office," Miller spat. "Oh wait, you can't. You get fired for cause you get nothing. No severance, no references. And good luck finding another gig in this town with thief stamped on your record." He nodded to the guards. "Escort him off the premises. Now." They grabbed my arms. I didn't struggle. There was no point in fighting the pawns when you were hunting the king. They marched me down the main aisle, parading me past the assembly lines like a captured criminal. Heads turned. Safety goggles were lifted. I saw pity in some eyes, relief in others, relief that the axe had fallen on me and not them. I walked with my head high, memorizing every face, every detail. They shoved me through the metal turnstiles and out onto the hot asphalt of the parking lot. The heavy steel gate slammed shut behind me with a finality that was meant to crush my spirit. I stood there for a moment, dusting off my sleeves. It was a masterstroke, really. Richard hadn't just fired me, he had burned my boats. By branding me a thief, he ensured that no other reputable company would hire me. He had engineered a situation where his offer, the janitor job, wasn't just an option. It was my only option. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me to crawl back to him begging for the mop. He thought he had checkmated me. He thought he had cut off my retreat. He didn't realize that he hadn't trapped me outside. He had just freed me to operate without the constraints of an employee handbook. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a burner phone, a device that didn't exist as far as the Sterling family was concerned. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang once. "Bennett," I said, my voice cutting through the morning humidity. "Yes, sir." The lawyer's voice was crisp, immediate. "It is done." He took the bait. "Prepare the employment dossier and the surveillance suite." "Are we proceeding with the acquisition?" Bennett asked. "No," I replied, looking up at the towering glass facade of the headquarters where Richard sat in his air-conditioned office thinking he had won. "We are not just acquiring it, Bennett. We are dismantling it from the inside out. I am going into the lion's den. Make sure the trap is set." I steered the F-150 away from the gleaming glass towers of the business district and down into the gritty industrial underbelly of the city. The warehouse looked like a relic from a forgotten era. The brick facade was crumbling, the windows were shattered teeth in a broken jaw, and the graffiti on the steel doors promised violence to trespassers. To the world, it was a condemned building, waiting for a wrecking ball. To me, it was the only place where I could truly breathe. I pulled the truck into the loading bay, shielded from the street by a mountain of rusted shipping containers. I walked to a service door that looked like it hadn't been opened since the 80s. I didn't use a key. I pressed my thumb against a scanner disguised as a discolored brick. A heavy solenoid clicked and the door slid open with a silent hydraulic hiss, revealing a pristine titanium elevator. As the doors closed, sealing out the smell of decay, the air conditioning kicked in, crisp and filtered. The elevator descended past the basement, past the sewers, deep into the bedrock. When the doors opened again, the grime of the surface world was gone. I stepped onto polished concrete floors, in a space that hummed with the quiet power of a supercomputer. Walls of glass enclosed server racks that blinked like a digital heartbeat. This was the nerve center of Argos Capital. This was where the billion-dollar decisions were made. Bennett Ross was waiting for me. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than Richard's car, and he was pacing the length of the command center like a caged tiger. When he saw me, he stopped his face, a mask of controlled fury. "They fired you," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice echoed in the cavernous space. "They fired the owner for stealing bolts." "Mason, tell me you are joking. Tell me I don't have to ruin the police chief's career today for letting his officers drag you out like a criminal." I walked past him and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady. "Relax, Bennett," I said. "It is part of the narrative. Richard needs to feel powerful. He needs to believe I am destitute. If he thinks I am a threat, he will hide the evidence. If he thinks I am a janitor, he will leave his safe unlocked." Bennett shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "You are taking this too far. You are going to scrub toilets, Mason. You are worth $1.5 billion. You shouldn't be handling a mop, you should be handling a hostile takeover." "I am handling a hostile takeover," I corrected him. "I am just doing it from the ground up, literally." Bennett sighed, realizing he couldn't change my mind. He walked over to a glass desk and picked up a small silver object. It looked like a standard USB drive, the kind you would find in a college dorm. He tossed it to me. I caught it. It felt heavy, dense. "That is not from Best Buy," Bennett said, his voice lowering. "That is military grade. It carries a polymorphic worm. It doesn't just copy files, Mason. It maps the entire network. It finds the deleted emails, the hidden partitions, the offshore accounts that don't appear on the official ledger." I turned the drive over in my fingers. "What do I have to do?" "Get it into his machine," Bennett said. "The main terminal in his office. Not the secretary's desk, not the conference room. His personal computer. It needs physical contact to bypass the firewall. Once it is in, you need to leave it there for 45 seconds. 45 seconds, I repeated. That is an eternity when you are trespassing." Bennett warned. If he catches me, I am just the janitor." I said, pocketing the drive. "I am just the guy emptying the trash. Who pays attention to the help?" Bennett looked at me with a mixture of admiration and worry. "Just be careful, Mason. If they find that drive, they won't just fire you. They will bury you." I looked at the reflection of the janitor in the glass wall superimposed over the image of the billionaire. "Let them try," I said. "I am already underground." The blue polyester jumpsuit was stiff and smelled faintly of industrial lemon cleaner and other men's sweat. I zipped it up to my chin, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror of the basement locker room. It was the perfect camouflage. In a three-piece suit, I was a competitor. In this, I was part of the furniture, invisible and irrelevant. I clipped the plastic ID badge to my chest. Mason Reed. Sanitation. It weighed less than an ounce, but it felt heavier than the platinum watch I had left in the biometric safe at the warehouse. I pushed my cart out into the hallway, the wheels squeaking, a rhythmic announcement of my arrival. Sterling Dynamics headquarters was a glass and steel monument to Richard's ego, soaring 30 stories above the city. I walked past glass-walled offices, where analysts were frantically crunching numbers. I could see the panic in their body language, the frenetic energy of people trying to patch holes in a sinking ship with spreadsheets. I knew those numbers better than they did. I knew exactly where the leaks were because I was the one who had designed the hull. "Janitor." The voice boomed from the end of the corridor. It was Richard's executive assistant, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "Mr. Sterling needs you in the main conference room. Immediately." I didn't rush. I walked with the plodding, resigned gait of a man who is paid by the hour, not by the outcome. When I pushed the heavy double doors open, the air conditioning hit me, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and anxiety. The room was full. Richard sat at the head of the massive mahogany table flanked by Brad and three men I recognized immediately. They were venture capitalists from a Dubai consortium, notoriously aggressive and notoriously thorough. They were looking at a holographic projection of a new jet engine prototype. A prototype I knew for a fact had failed its stress test 3 days ago. Richard stopped talking mid-sentence when he saw me. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face like oil on water. "Ah, gentlemen," Richard said, gesturing towards me with a wide, sweeping hand as if I were a prize exhibit. "I want you to meet the newest member of our team. This is my son-in-law, Mason. He is learning the business from the ground up." "Literally?" Brad snorted, covering his mouth with a hand that sported a gaudy gold pinky ring. The investors looked uncomfortable, shifting in their leather chairs, uncertain how to react to this display of domestic dominance. Mason Richard said, his voice dripping with faux congeniality. "We seem to have had a little accident." He picked up his porcelain cup full of steaming black coffee. He didn't even pretend to slip. He looked me dead in the eye and tipped his wrist. The dark liquid splashed onto the pristine white carpet, spreading like a growing bruise. "Whoops," Richard said, his eyes glittering with malice. "Clumsy me. Be a good lad and clean that up, will you? Show our partners how dedicated you are to keeping Sterling Dynamics spotless." It was a power move, crude and effective. He wanted to show these men that he controlled everything in his orbit, even his own family. He wanted me to snap. He wanted me to throw the mop at him so he could call security and have me dragged out, proving to everyone that I was trash. I didn't give him the satisfaction. "Right away, sir," I said, my voice void of emotion. I parked the cart and walked over with a rag and a spray bottle. I knelt at his feet. The humiliation was visceral. I was on my knees in front of the man who was robbing my company blind, while the man who wanted to steal my wife laughed at me. But as I scrubbed at the stain, my body blocking their view of the underside of the table, I reached into the deep pocket of my jumpsuit. I palmed a slender black cylinder that looked like a high-end fountain pen. It wasn't a pen. It was a military-grade listening device with a 10-day battery life and a direct uplink to Bennett's server. I made a show of scrubbing harder, putting my shoulder into it, my elbow bumping the underside of the heavy table. With a swift, practiced movement, I pressed the magnetic strip of the device against the metal support beam. It clicked softly, a sound masked by the squeak of my rag against the wet carpet. "There you go, sir," I said, standing up and dropping the dirty rag into my bucket. "Good as new." Richard didn't even look at me. He just waved his hand dismissively, turning back to the investors. "You missed a spot, but it will do. Get out." I turned and walked out, pushing my cart. My knees were wet with coffee, but I was smiling on the inside. Because now I was in the room, and I wasn't leaving. Richard left for lunch at 12 sharp, walking out with Brad to celebrate a loan that I knew would never be approved by the underwriting committee I secretly controlled. The heavy oak door to the CEO's office clicked shut, leaving me alone with the hum of the air conditioner and the smell of expensive leather and stale ambition. I had 45 minutes before his secretary returned from her yoga class. I didn't waste a second. I wasn't there to empty the wastebaskets, I was there to mine them. I moved to the desk, scanning the surface. Clean. Too clean. Richard was paranoid, which meant the good stuff wasn't lying around. It was either in the wall safe behind the Monet painting, or it was already destroyed. I knelt by the heavy-duty shredder in the corner. A red light was blinking furiously on the console. Jammed. He had tried to force too many pages through at once in a hurry to hide his tracks before Brad arrived. Amateurs always make mistakes when they panic. I unplugged the machine and opened the housing. The blades were choked with thick bond paper compressed into a solid white brick. I reached in with my gloved hands, carefully working the clump free. Most of it was confetti, useless dust. But near the top, where the mechanism had seized, there were long, jagged strips of paper that had been mangled but not severed. I laid the strips out on the carpet, piecing them together like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. To anyone else, these were just random numbers and legal jargon. But I don't see numbers the way normal people do. I have an eidetic memory for financial data, a quirk of brain chemistry that had turned me from a broke college student into a billionaire by the age of 25. I could look at a balance sheet once and recall every decimal point 10 years later. I scanned the fragmented lines. Invoice number 4099, service rendered consulting. Amount $500,000, payable to Blue Sky Holdings. My mind raced, connecting the dots faster than a supercomputer. Blue Sky. I knew that name. I had seen it on a list of flagged entities during a due diligence audit of a shell corporation in Panama 2 years ago. I looked at the routing number on the next strip. Truk 9. That wasn't a domestic bank. That was the SWIFT prefix for the Cayman Islands, specifically the Merchant Bank of Georgetown. Richard wasn't just cooking the books to get a loan. He was siphoning profit directly out of the company. He was paying a ghost firm $500,000 a month for consulting services that didn't exist. He was bleeding Sterling Dynamics dry, stealing from the shareholders, stealing from the employees he was firing, and unknowingly stealing from me. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of the reconstructed document. Then I carefully gathered the paper strips. I couldn't leave them there, and I couldn't shred them. I shoved them deep into my pocket next to the listening device I hadn't planted yet. I put the shredder back together, clearing the jam, but leaving a few innocuous pieces of paper inside so it looked like I had just fixed a minor issue. I stood up, brushing the lint from my knees. I had the smoking gun. Richard wasn't just a bad businessman, he was a felon, and Blue Sky Holdings was about to experience a very turbulent storm. I grabbed my spray bottle and started wiping down the desk just as the door handle began to turn. I was just the janitor doing my job, cleaning up the filth they left behind. I rented a studio apartment on 4th Street for $600 a month. It was a single room with a window that wouldn't close and a radiator that clanked like a dying engine. The carpet was stained with the history of previous tenants' failures, and the hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and stale cigarettes. To Vanessa, it was a dungeon. To me, it was a stage set. I had moved in 3 days ago, telling her I needed space to focus on my new role as a sanitation engineer. In reality, I needed a base of operations that didn't have her father's security cameras watching my every move. When she knocked on the door, I was ready. I had set the scene perfectly. A few empty noodle cups in the trash, a pile of job application forms I had no intention of filling out, and right in the center of the wobbly laminate table, a single ivory envelope. It was heavy, thick cardstock. The return address was simply a P.O. box in Zurich. Inside was a transaction receipt for my quarterly dividend payout. $50 million. Vanessa stepped inside, wrapping her cashmere coat tighter around herself, as if the poverty in the air might be contagious. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with horror. "Mason," she said, her voice trembling, "you can't live here. This place it isn't safe. My father is still angry, but if you just apologize, maybe he will let you come back to the guest house." I walked to the kitchenette to pour her a glass of water, my back to her. I needed to give her the opening. "I am fine here, Ness," I said. "It is what I can afford on a janitor's salary. Besides, I have some prospects. Things are looking up." I heard the rustle of paper. The bait was taken. I counted to 3 silently. 1, 2, 3. "Mason." Her voice wasn't curious. It was strangled. I turned around. She was holding the document, her hands shaking so violently the paper was blurring. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her looking like a wax statue. She wasn't looking at the money with greed. She was looking at it with sheer, unadulterated terror. $50 million, she whispered. The number seemed to choke her. Where did you get this? I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. I made some investments. Investments, she shrilled, her voice cracking. You are a factory worker, Mason. You don't have investments. You have debt. You have a truck that barely starts. She looked from the paper to me, her eyes darting around the shabby room, connecting dots that didn't exist. She saw the peeling paint. She saw the cheap furniture. She saw a man who had just been fired for stealing titanium bolts. And then she saw the $50 million. In her mind, there was only one explanation that fit her worldview. I wasn't a secret genius. I was a criminal. Is this why Dad fired you? She stammered, backing away toward the door. Did you steal this from the company? Or are you moving drugs? Is that why you insisted on keeping that old truck? To move product. The accusation hit me harder than I expected. I had hoped for a split second that she might believe in me, that she might think I was capable of success. But her faith in me was so non-existent that she would rather believe I was a felon than a success story. Vanessa, look at the date, I said, taking a step forward. Stay back, she screamed, holding her purse up like a shield. Do not come near me. If the police find this, if Dad finds out, I can't be involved in this, Mason. I have a reputation. She threw the paper onto the floor as if it were burning her skin. She fumbled for the doorknob, her breathing coming in short, panic-stricken gasps. I am going to pretend I didn't see this, she said. Her eyes filled with tears of fear. For your sake, Mason, get rid of it, before you end up in prison for the rest of your life. She tore the door open and ran out into the hallway, her heels clattering on the linoleum, a frantic rhythm of escape. I stood there looking at the document lying on the dirty carpet. $50 million. Proof of my empire. And to my wife, it was just evidence of a crime she couldn't wait to distance herself from. I picked up the paper and dusted it off. She had failed the final test, but she had given me exactly what I needed. She was terrified, and terrified people make mistakes. Terrified people run to the person they think can protect them. She was running straight to Richard. I didn't need to be in the room to know exactly how the scene played out at the Sterling estate. I knew the players and I knew the script because I had written it. Vanessa drove straight from my rundown apartment to her father's mansion, her tires screeching on the asphalt, a desperate flight from a reality she refused to accept. She burst into Richard's study, where he was undoubtedly nursing a scotch with Brad, likely celebrating their cleverness in turning a son-in-law into a servant. She threw the photo she had taken of the bank statement onto the mahogany desk. Her hands were shaking so hard, she knocked over a coaster. He has $50 million, Dad, she gasped. $50 million. I saw the receipt. It is in an offshore account. Richard picked up the phone, zooming in on the image. For a moment, there was silence. Then a low rumble started in his chest, growing into a bark of incredulous laughter. He tossed the phone onto the leather blotter as if it were a joke. $50 million, Richard scoffed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. The man who steals bolts from my factory floor. The man who drives a truck held together by rust and prayers. Vanessa, use your head. Mason doesn't have $50 million. He doesn't even have $50. But I saw it, Vanessa insisted, her voice rising in hysteria. It looked real, Dad. The bank, the transaction codes. It is real money, Richard said, his face hardening into a sneer. But it isn't his, not legally. Think about it. He was just fired for theft. He has access to our supply chain. He has been selling us out the back door for years, probably moving high-grade alloys to the black market. Or worse, he is laundering money for a cartel. That is why he wanted that janitor job, to clean up his tracks before we found the rest of the evidence. Brad leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the predatory focus of a banker who smells blood in the water. He picked up the phone, studying the image with professional detachment. "If this is real," Brad said slowly, his voice smooth and dangerous, "then we have him. This isn't just petty theft, Richard. This is federal territory, structuring, money laundering, wire fraud. If we report this to the Economic Crimes Unit, they won't just arrest him. They will freeze every asset he has under civil forfeiture laws. He won't be able to hire a lawyer. He won't be able to make bail. He will be buried before he even sees a judge." Richard looked at Brad, a slow smile spreading across his face, a smile that was pure malice. "We can end him," Richard murmured. "We can put him away for 20 years. Brad turned to Vanessa. He reached out and took her hand, his touch possessive. "But we need a witness, Vanessa. We need someone to go on record saying they saw the document. Someone to testify that he has been acting erratic, secretive. Someone to say they suspected he was involved in criminal activity." Vanessa looked at Brad, then at her father. She looked at the two men who controlled her world, who defined her worth. Then she thought of me standing in that dirty apartment, surrounded by noodle cups and millions of dollars of unexplained cash. She didn't see a husband. She saw a liability. She saw a scandal that could stain her reputation. "I will do it," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolved. "I can't be married to a criminal. I won't let him drag me down. I will tell the police whatever they need to know. Just get him out of my life, Dad. Please." Richard stood up and walked over to his daughter, kissing her on the forehead. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said, pulling out his phone to dial the chief of police. "By tomorrow morning, Mason Reed will be nothing but a bad memory. We are going to crush him." The server room was freezing, a refrigerated tomb of silicon and spinning hard drives. The hum was deafening, a white noise that drowned out the sound of my own breathing. I swiped my janitor keycard. The light turned green. Richard was so obsessed with keeping people out, he forgot that someone had to go in to empty the trash cans. I stepped inside the blue light of the servers, washing over my face. I didn't waste time looking for the trash. I went straight to the main terminal, the central nervous system of Sterling Dynamics. I pulled the military-grade USB drive from my pocket. My hands were steady. I plugged it into the rear port of the primary cluster. The screen flickered. A command prompt appeared, executing the script Bennett had written. It wasn't just copying files, it was hunting. It was looking for the shadow books, the real ledger that Richard kept hidden behind layers of encryption. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 20%. 40%. I checked my watch. I had 30 seconds before the silent alarm I had tripped sent a notification to the security desk. 60%. I saw the file names scrolling by. Cayman transfers. Shell Company dividends. The real inventory counts that proved Richard was selling phantom stock. It was all there. 80%. The heavy steel door behind me didn't just open. It was thrown against the wall. A beam of tactical light cut through the gloom, blinding me. Freeze. Hands where I can see them, Reed. It was Miller, the foreman, who had fired me. He was standing there with a taser, his face twisted in a triumphant grin. Richard had sent him. He hadn't trusted me to just clean the floors. He had put a tail on me, waiting for me to slip up. "I knew you were up to something," Miller spat, stepping into the room. "Stealing hardware now? Or are you trying to sell corporate secrets to the Chinese? Richard is going to love this." I didn't raise my hands. I looked at the screen. 99%. "I am just dusting the vents, Miller," I said calmly, blocking his view of the port with my body. "It is part of the job description." "Don't give me that smart mouth," Miller growled, raising the taser. "Step away from the console, now." The screen flashed green. Transfer complete. I reached back with one fluid motion and yanked the drive free, palming it instantly. I turned to face him, holding up my empty hands in a mock surrender. "Okay, Miller, you got me. I was just checking my email." Miller laughed, a harsh barking sound. He walked over, pushing me aside to look at the screen. It was blank. The worm erased itself after execution, leaving no trace. He frowned, confused. He patted me down roughly, his hands patting my chest, my sides. He missed the small coin pocket inside my waistband, where the drive was now resting against my skin, warm and heavy with the weight of Richard's destruction. Get out. Miller shoved me toward the door. I am calling the cops. You are going to jail for trespassing. I stumbled out into the hallway, my cleaning cart waiting there like a loyal dog. Miller was busy on his radio calling Richard, probably already bragging about his catch. He didn't notice that I wasn't panicked. He didn't notice that I wasn't running. I stopped in the middle of the executive corridor right in front of the elevator. I looked at the mop bucket, the gray water reflecting the fluorescent lights. I looked at the spray bottles and the rags. I was done. I didn't need this camouflage anymore. I left the cart right there in the center of the hallway, a steel obstruction that demanded attention. It was a message. I was finished cleaning up their mess. Now I was going to make one of my own. I walked to the service elevator, pressing the button with a firm, deliberate finger. I could hear Miller shouting behind me, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from another world. I patted the drive in my pocket. I had the smoking gun. I had the bullets. And tomorrow morning, I was going to start shooting. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of Sterling Dynamics, blinding me for a second as I stepped through the revolving doors. I wasn't wearing the blue jumpsuit today. I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, the uniform of a man who had nothing left to lose, or so they thought. The lobby was quiet, too quiet. The receptionist wasn't at her desk. The security guard was missing from his post. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was the silence of a held breath before the scream. Then the world exploded in noise and motion. Blue and red lights flashed against the marble walls, reflecting off the polished floors, like a strobe light in a nightmare. Sirens wailed outside, piercing the air. 4 uniformed officers burst from the side corridors, their hands on their holsters, their faces set in grim determination. They moved with the aggressive coordination of a SWAT team, taking down a terrorist, not a janitor suspected of stealing files. Freeze. Get on the ground. Now. I didn't run. I didn't reach for my pockets. I stood perfectly still, raising my hands, slowly letting them see I was unarmed. I let them slam me against the reception desk, the cold stone biting into my cheek. I let them twist my arms behind my back, the handcuffs ratcheting shut, with a metallic finality that echoed in the cavernous space. From high above, a voice boomed down like a gavel striking a sounding block. That is him. That is the economic spy. Arrest him. I twisted my neck, looking up toward the mezzanine level. Richard Sterling stood there, leaning over the glass railing, his face flushed with the ecstasy of victory. He pointed a shaking finger at me, playing the role of the violated CEO to perfection. He looked like a Roman emperor condemning a gladiator to the lions. And standing right next to him was Vanessa. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the floor, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. She wore a pristine white dress, innocent and pure, contrasting sharply with the dirty work she had just helped facilitate. She stood by her father's side physically and metaphorically, aligning herself with the power she thought would protect her. She couldn't bear to watch the man she married being dragged away in chains. It was the final severance, the last thread of our marriage snapping under the weight of her cowardice. I felt a rough hand on my shoulder, yanking me upright. You have the right to remain silent, the officer barked, his breath hot in my ear. I didn't say a word. I didn't plead. I didn't beg Vanessa for help. Instead, I looked past the officers, past Richard's gloating face, past Vanessa's shame. I looked directly at the black dome of the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. The red light blinked once, a slow, deliberate wink. I stared into the lens, locking eyes with the man I knew was watching from the safety of the underground server room miles away. Bennett was there. He was recording every second of this false arrest. He was logging every violation of procedure, every lie Richard shouted. I didn't smile, but my eyes sent a message clear as day. Let them take me. Let them think they won. The trap is sprung. Take him away! Richard shouted, his voice cracking with glee. Get that filth out of my building. As they marched me toward the exit, the flashing lights painting my world in chaotic colors, I walked with my head high. They were arresting a janitor. They had no idea they were kidnapping a king. The metal table was cold against my forearms, sending a chill through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. But it was the only cold thing in the room. The air was hot and stagnant, smelling of stale coffee and aggressive desperation. Across from me sat Sheriff Patterson. I recognized him immediately. I had seen him on the golf course with Richard, laughing at bad jokes and cheating on his scorecard. He wasn't just a lawman, he was a paid friend, a member of the club where admission cost your integrity. He stared at me for a long time, trying to use silence as a weapon. He wanted me to squirm. He wanted the janitor to crack under the weight of authority. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just watched him counting the beads of sweat forming on his upper lip. He was nervous. He knew this arrest was built on sand, and he needed a confession to turn it into concrete. Patterson sighed a heavy theatrical sound and reached over to the console on the wall. With a definitive click, he turned off the recording light. The red eye of the camera went dark. The pretense of procedure vanished, leaving only the raw corruption in the room. Let us cut the crap, Reed Patterson said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. We are off the record now, just you and me, and he pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket and tapped one out, not lighting it, just rolling it between his thick fingers. Richard is a good man, Patterson continued, a pillar of this community. He gives to charity. He employs half the town. And you are just an embarrassment, a thief who bit the hand that fed him. I stayed silent, letting him talk, letting him dig his own grave. Here is the reality, son, Patterson said, his voice hardening. We found the digital footprint. We know you were in the server room. We know you accessed files you had no business seeing. That is industrial espionage. That is grand larceny. That is 20 years in a federal prison where the inmates won't be as polite as I am. He slid a single sheet of paper across the metal table. It was a confession, typed up and ready for a signature. But Richard is a forgiving man, Patterson lied, his eyes flat and dead. He doesn't want to ruin his daughter's life by having her husband rot in a cell. You sign this. You admit you stole the data to sell it. You agree to a plea deal. 2 years probation and you leave town. You never speak to Vanessa again. You disappear. I looked at the paper. It was a suicide note for my reputation. If I signed it, I would be admitting to a felony I didn't commit. I would be giving them exactly what they wanted, a legal reason to strip me of everything. Patterson slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. Sign it, Reed, he barked, losing his patience. Do you think you have a choice? You have no money, you have no friends, you have a wife who is testifying against you right now in the next room. You are alone. Nobody cares what happens to a janitor. I looked up from the paper, meeting his gaze with a calmness that unsettled him. He expected fear. He expected tears. Instead, he saw boredom. I leaned back in the uncomfortable metal chair, crossing my arms. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I am done listening to your sales pitch. Sheriff, I said, my voice steady. Patterson's face turned a shade of purple. You listen to me, you little... I cut him off. I want to make my phone call. I want to call my lawyer. Patterson laughed, a harsh barking sound. Your lawyer. You can't afford a public defender, Reed. Who are you going to call? Legal aid. I smiled. It was a small, cold smile. And Sheriff, I added, ignoring his taunt. You might want to bring an extra chair in here. A comfortable one. Maybe the leather one from your office? Patterson frowned, confused by the request. What? Because my lawyer hates standing, I said, keeping my eyes locked on his, and he gets very cranky when his back hurts. You really don't want to see him cranky. Patterson opened his mouth to shout again and to demand I sign the paper that would ruin my life, but the words died in his throat. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room didn't just open. It swung inward with a force that banged against the wall, vibrating through the floor. Patterson jumped, spinning around in his chair, his hand instinctively going to his holster before he realized who it was. Standing in the doorway wasn't a court-appointed lawyer with a cheap suit and a heavy caseload. It was Bennett Ross, and he looked like he had just stepped off a private jet because he had. He was wearing a navy blue bespoke suit that fit him like armor. His eyes were cold blue chips of ice that scanned the room, assessing the threat level and finding it laughable. But Bennett wasn't alone. Flanking him was a man in a crisp uniform with stars on his collar. State Police Chief Henderson, the man who signed Patterson's paychecks. The man who could end Patterson's career with a single phone call. Sheriff Patterson. Henderson barked, his voice cutting through the stagnant air. Step away from the suspect. Now. Patterson stumbled back, his face draining of color. Chief, I didn't know you were... we have a situation here. This man is an industrial spy. We were just... securing a confession under duress. Bennett finished for him, stepping into the room. He didn't look at Patterson. He looked at me, checking for bruises, checking for damage. Then he looked at the camera with the unlit red light, turning off the recording device during an interrogation. That is a Class A felony violation of procedure, Sheriff. I hope your pension is fully funded. You are going to need it. Bennett walked to the metal table. He carried a leather briefcase that looked soft enough to sleep on. He set it down with a gentle thud right on top of the coerced confession Patterson had tried to make me sign. Bennett clicked the latches open. He pulled out a single thick document bound in heavy blue paper. He tossed it onto the table. It slid across the metal surface, stopping inches from Patterson's trembling hands. Read it, Bennett commanded. Patterson looked down. What is this? That Bennett said, his voice smooth and deadly as my client's tax return from last fiscal year, specifically his personal income tax. Patterson frowned, flipping the page. His eyes scanned the lines, and then they bulged. He choked. 15 million, Bennett said, answering the question before Patterson could ask it. Mr. Mason Reed paid $15 million in federal income tax last year. Not on a company. On his personal earnings. That puts his net worth somewhere north of the GDP of this entire county. Bennett leaned in his hands on the table, getting right in Patterson's face. Now tell me, Sheriff, do you really think a man who pays $15 million in taxes needs to steal titanium bolts from a factory? Do you think a man who owns a portfolio of international real estate is interested in selling spark plugs on the black market? Patterson looked at me. He looked at the janitor in the t-shirt and jeans. And then he looked at the document again. The reality of his mistake crashed down on him. He hadn't just arrested an innocent man, he had arrested a shark disguised as a minnow. Chief Henderson stepped forward, his face red with anger. Get those cuffs off him, Patterson. Right now. And you better pray Mr. Reed is feeling generous enough not to sue this department into the Stone Age. Patterson fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so bad he dropped them twice. He unlocked the cuffs. I rubbed my wrists, standing up slowly. I looked at Bennett. Did you bring the car? It is waiting outside, Sir Bennett said. I looked at Patterson one last time. He was slumped in his chair, defeated. Thank you for the hospitality, Sheriff, I said. We will be in touch. The back seat of Bennett's armored SUV was quieter than a church and smelled of fresh leather. I sank into the seat watching the police station fade into the distance through tinted windows. I didn't go home. Home was a concept that had evaporated the moment my wife stood by and watched me get handcuffed. Instead, we drove straight to the airfield where Bennett's mobile command center was waiting. I pulled my phone from the evidence bag the police had sheepishly returned. It was dead battery drained, much like my marriage. I plugged it into the car's charger and watched it boot up. 17 missed calls, 14 text messages, all from Vanessa. None of them asked if I was okay. They were all demands, accusations, and instructions on how to surrender. I dialed her number. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight and icy, the voice of a stranger. Mason. How are you calling me? Did you use your one phone call, or did you bribe someone with that dirty money? I didn't answer. I just listened to the sound of her breathing, the background noise of ice clinking in a glass. She was at her father's house. I could hear Richard's booming laugh in the distance. They were celebrating my demise. Vanessa, I said, my voice calm. I am out. There was a pause. Out? You mean out on bail? Oh God. Mason. Dad said the bond would be set at $1 million. Did you actually pay it? You just confirmed everything. Only a criminal has that kind of cash lying around. She didn't sound relieved. She sounded disgusted. She had bought the lie so completely that the truth looked like guilt to her. Listen to me, she hissed, lowering her voice. Dad is willing to make a deal. He knows the district attorney. He can get the charges reduced, maybe even get you probation instead of 20 years, but you have to cooperate. Cooperate, I repeated. Yes, you have to confess. You have to admit you stole the money in the files, and you have to return every cent, all 50 million. If you do that, Dad will help you. And what about us, Ness? I asked, though I already knew the answer. There is no U.S. Mason, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. I can't be married to a felon. I have a reputation to think about. I have the family name to protect. Dad had the lawyers draw up the papers this morning. They are contested divorce papers, irreconcilable differences and criminal conduct. You need to sign them. If you sign them and give back the money, Dad will ask for leniency. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Kick a man when he is down, then offer him a hand up only if he agrees to cut his own throat. She wanted me to confess to a crime I didn't commit and sign away my rights just to save her from embarrassment. I looked out the window at the passing city lights. I felt a strange sense of lightness. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had made her choice. She had chosen the illusion of power over the reality of love. Okay, I said softly. Vanessa paused, surprised by my surrender. Okay. You will sign, I will sign, I said. I will give you exactly what you want, Vanessa. I will end this marriage tonight. Good, she let out a breath she had been holding. That is the right thing to do. Come to the house, the lawyers are here. We can get this over with. I chuckled, a dry sound that made Bennett look up from his tablet. No, Vanessa, I am not coming to the house, and I am not signing those papers. What you just said? I said I would sign, I interrupted. But I am not signing the papers your father wrote. I am signing my own. And when I do, you are going to wish you had never asked for a divorce. I hung up the phone before she could respond. I looked at Bennett. Draft the petition, I said. Irreconcilable differences. And Bennett, yes, sir, make sure the prenuptial agreement is attached. The one she signed without reading because she thought I was broke. Bennett smiled, a shark sensing blood in the water. With pleasure. The crystal decanter clinked against the heavy tumbler, a sound that usually signaled the closing of a deal, but tonight signaled the end of a man. Richard poured the amber scotch with a steady hand, his face flushed with the adrenaline of victory. He didn't look like a man who had just sent his son-in-law to jail. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. To sanitation, Richard proposed raising his glass high, to taking out the trash permanently. Brad laughed, that wet, condescending sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the library. He was lounging in the leather armchair that used to be Mason's favorite spot during family gatherings, not that Mason was ever really welcome in it. Brad clinked his glass against Richard's. To cleaning house, Brad added his eyes gleaming with the reflection of the chandelier. And to new acquisitions. They drank, savoring the burn of the expensive alcohol. I sat on the velvet sofa a few feet away, clutching a glass of water, my hands cold. I should have felt relieved. That is what I kept telling myself. I had done the hard thing. I had done the right thing. I had protected the Sterling name from a scandal that could have destroyed us all. Mason was a criminal. The police had arrested him. The evidence was undeniable. I had cut out a cancer before it could kill the host. But as I watched them, the relief didn't come. Instead, there was just a vast, echoing hollowness in my chest. I looked at the empty space on my finger where my wedding ring used to be. I had taken it off in the car on the way back from the police station. It felt lighter, but somehow my hand felt heavier. Richard didn't notice my silence. He was too busy plotting the next move on the chessboard. He leaned in towards Brad, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. With Mason discredited and facing federal charges, the audit trail is dead, Richard said. No one is going to believe a disgruntled felon if he tries to talk about irregularities. We are in the clear, Brad. We can proceed with the merger immediately. Brad nodded, shifting into business mode. My board is ready, Richard. We acquire Sterling Dynamics by the end of the week. We absorb the assets and the liabilities. The integration process will be chaotic by design. Exactly, Richard said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. And in that chaos, the Cayman discrepancies simply vanish. By the time anyone looks closely at the blue sky accounts, they will just be a rounding error in a multi-billion-dollar ledger. We bury the debt, we bury the evidence, and we walk away richer than God. I frowned slightly. Cayman discrepancies. Blue sky accounts. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I assumed it was just high-level finance beyond my understanding. I trusted my father. He was a titan of industry. He knew what was best. Brad turned his gaze to me. He smiled, a shark sizing up a meal. Don't look so sad, Vanessa, he said smoothly. You did the right thing today. You traded a janitor for a future. That is an upgrade in anyone's book. Once this merger is done, you and I should celebrate properly. Maybe a trip to Paris. I forced a weak smile. I suppose so, I whispered. Richard slammed his hand on the desk, startling me. It is settled then. Tomorrow morning we call the emergency board meeting. We announce the merger. Tomorrow we become untouchable. They raised their glasses again, toasting to a future that was already dead, oblivious to the digital tsunami that was racing through the fiber optic cables toward their pockets. I watched the digital clock on Bennett's dashboard flip from 7:59 to 8:00. It was a precise, sterile change of a number, but in the real world, it was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. I pressed the enter key on the laptop. Miles away in the library of the Sterling estate, the air was shattered. It started with a low hum, then a vibration against the mahogany desk, then a chime, then another. It wasn't just Richard's phone. It was Brad's. It was the tablet sitting on the side table. It was Vanessa's phone in her purse. Every device connected to the Sterling Dynamics board network lit up simultaneously, like a Christmas tree in hell. Richard frowned, annoyed by the intrusion into his victory lap. He reached for his phone, swirling his scotch with his other hand. Probably just a server alert, he muttered, dismissing the noise. Or the press getting wind of the arrest. He unlocked the screen. The annoyance on his face didn't fade, it froze. It solidified into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "What the hell is this?" Richard whispered, his glass of scotch stopping halfway to his mouth. Brad checked his own phone. His smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by the pallor of a man who realizes he has bet the house on a losing horse. Argos Capital, Brad read aloud, his voice trembling. Urgent notice of extraordinary general meeting, pursuant to Article 4, Section 9 of the Corporate Charter. Richard snatched the phone from the desk, holding it up to the light, as if reading it closer would change the words. The majority shareholder hereby summons the Board of Directors for an emergency session at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Richard read, his voice rising in pitch to a near scream. Agenda Item 1. Immediate removal of Richard Sterling as CEO for cause. Agenda Item 2. Appointment of new chairman of the board. The room went deathly silent. The ice in the glasses stopped clinking. Vanessa looked up, her eyes wide with fear, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. She had never seen her father look like this. He looked small. He looked hunted. "Who is Argos Capital?" Richard screamed, throwing his phone onto the couch. He began pacing the room frantically, running his hands through his thinning hair. "We don't have a shareholder named Argos. I know every major investor. I know every fund. Who are they? And how do they have the authority to call a meeting?" Brad was scrolling furiously on his phone, his banking instincts kicking in. "They are a blind trust, Richard. A ghost fund. They have been buying up preferred stock for 5 years, quietly absorbing every share that hit the market. They own 45%. If they partnered with the minority holders, they own the company." Richard gasped, the color draining from his face. He looked at the email again. The signature line was blank. Just a corporate seal. A seal that looked like a shield. "Why now?" Richard shouted, kicking the wastebasket, sending it crashing against the bookshelf. "Why tonight? We were winning. We had everything under control. Who is behind this? Who is Argos Capital?" He looked around the room, searching for an enemy he could fight, but there was no one there. Just the glowing screens of the phones delivering the message that his reign was over. He didn't know that the answer to his question was currently sitting in an armored SUV 5 miles away, preparing to drive a stake through the heart of his empire. The boardroom on the 30th floor smelled of stale coffee and fear. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline was shrouded in a morning gray mist, but inside the air was electric with panic. 12 men and women sat around the massive oval table, shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs. They were checking their phones, whispering to each other, eyes darting to the empty chair at the head of the table where the chairman usually sat. Richard stood at the front of the room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his tie was slightly crooked, a rare crack in his usually pristine armor. He slammed his hand onto the polished wood, silencing the murmurs. "Everyone calm down," Richard barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I have spoken to our legal team. This Argos Capital is nothing but a vulture fund. They bought up some preferred stock on the secondary market, and now they think they can strong-arm us. They think they can walk in here and dictate terms to me." He looked around the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Brad sat to his right, looking pale and sweating through his expensive shirt. Brad knew numbers, and he knew that 45% wasn't just a strong arm, it was a stranglehold. But he kept his mouth shut, terrified of Richard's wrath. "I built this company." Richard continued, his voice rising in volume and desperation. "I am Sterling Dynamics. No nameless, faceless investor is going to remove me from my own building. When their representative walks through that door, I am going to tell him to go to hell. I am going to have security throw him out, just like I threw out the trash yesterday." He pointed a shaking finger at the double mahogany doors at the far end of the room. "Let them come," Richard shouted. "Let them see who is really in charge here. I am the CEO. I am the only authority that matters." As if on cue, the heavy grandfather clock in the corner began to chime 9 times. The deep, resonant tolling sounded like a funeral march. On the final chime, the handle of the double doors turned. It wasn't a hesitant turn. It was firm, decisive. The latch clicked loudly in the silence. Richard straightened his jacket, putting on his best intimidation face, ready to scream at whatever lawyer or corporate suit walked in. The doors swung open. But it wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a stranger. Standing in the doorway was Mason. But it wasn't the Mason they knew. It wasn't the man in the grease-stained coveralls. It wasn't the man in the cheap t-shirt who had been dragged away in handcuffs less than 24 hours ago. This Mason was wearing a charcoal Italian suit that fit his frame with military precision. He wore a watch that caught the light, a Patek Philippe worth more than Richard's car. His hair was styled. His posture was erect and his eyes were clear-cold and terrifyingly focused. He didn't look like a janitor. He didn't look like a son-in-law. He looked like an emperor returning to claim a conquered city. Richard's mouth fell open. The scream he had prepared died in his throat, turning into a strangled gasp. The entire room froze. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the shattering of Richard's reality. Mason took one step into the room, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard stared at me for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity. Then his brain rebooted to the only setting it knew, which was dominance. He didn't see the suit. He didn't see the watch. He only saw the man he had broken, the man he had ordered to scrub his floors. His face turned a violent shade of crimson, and he slammed his fist onto the table so hard the water pitcher rattled. "Security!" Richard screamed, veins bulging in his neck like cords of rope. "What is he doing here? Who let the janitor in? Get him out. Someone call the guards and have this filth thrown back on the street before he steals the silverware." He looked around the table, expecting the other board members to jump up and tackle me. He expected them to share his outrage. But they didn't move. They were frozen, staring at the fabric of my lapel, recognizing the cut of a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than their annual bonuses combined. They were financial sharks, and they knew the smell of money. Richard was the only one in the room who still smelled the cleaning fluid. I didn't say a word. I didn't acknowledge his screaming. I simply reached up and buttoned my jacket. It was a single, deliberate movement. The click of the button was softer than a whisper, but in that silent room it sounded like a gun cocking. I took a step forward. "Richard, stop!" Brad hissed, tugging at Richard's sleeve. "Look at him. Just look at him." Richard shook him off. "I don't care what he is wearing. He is a thief. He is a nobody. Get out of my boardroom, Mason." I kept walking. I walked past Brad, who shrank back in his chair, the smell of fear radiating off him like a physical heat. I walked past the empty seat where I had been humiliated at dinner just 2 nights ago. I walked straight to the head of the table. Richard was standing there, blocking the chairman's chair. I stopped inches from his face. I didn't push him. I didn't touch him. I just looked at him with the weight of absolute authority. I looked at him with the eyes of the man who owned his debt, his building, and his future. He faltered. The scream died in his throat. He stepped back, stumbling slightly, his legs betraying him purely out of instinctual submission. I reached out and gripped the back of the heavy leather chair. The leather was cool under my hand. I pulled it out, the casters gliding smooth as silk on the carpet. I sat down. I placed my hands on the mahogany surface, claiming the space, claiming the room, claiming the air they breathed. Richard was gasping for air, pointing a shaking finger at me. You can't sit there. That is the chairman's seat. That is for the owner of Argos Capital." Bennett stepped out from behind me. He carried himself with the lethal grace of an executioner. He cleared his throat, a sound that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Bennett said, his voice ringing with the clarity of a church bell. "Please allow me to correct a misunderstanding. Mr. Sterling is right. That seat is reserved for the owner of Argos Capital." He gestured to me with an open hand. "May I introduce you to Mr. Mason Reed, founder and sole proprietor of Argos Capital." owner of 45% of Sterling Dynamics. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, your new boss. The silence that followed Bennett's announcement was absolute, but it was fragile, like a sheet of glass waiting to shatter. And then Brad shattered it. He leaped to his feet so fast, his chair toppled backward, crashing against the credenza. His face was a mask of disbelief and panic, the face of a man who was watching his entire worldview disintegrate. "That is impossible," Brad stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is a joke. It has to be a joke. Look at his hands. I have seen them. They are calloused. He is a factory worker. He is a nobody who puts screws into holes. He cannot be Argos Capital. I know the market. I know the players. A factory worker does not own an investment fund." Bennett didn't argue. He didn't even look at Brad. He simply pressed a button on a remote control he had pulled from his pocket. The motorized blinds on the windows descended, cutting off the gray morning light and plunging the room into semi-darkness. The projector on the ceiling hummed to life, throwing a beam of stark white light against the far wall. A document appeared on the screen. It was an old wire transfer dated 5 years ago. The amount was massive, $30 million. The destination was Sterling Dynamics operating account. Bennett clicked the remote again. The image zoomed in on the authorization line at the bottom of the document. The signature was written in bold, decisive black ink. It wasn't a scribble. It was legible. M. Reed. I watched Richard's face as he stared at the screen. I saw the gears turning in his head, grinding against the rust of his prejudice. He remembered that day. He remembered the panic, the creditors banging on the door, the payroll checks that were about to bounce. "You remember that winter, don't you, Richard?" I asked, my voice cutting through the hum of the projector. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "We were going under," he whispered. "The banks had frozen our lines of credit. We couldn't pay for raw materials. Then the money just appeared. An anonymous angel investor." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, interlacing my fingers. "I was the angel, Richard. I bought your bad debt. I injected the liquidity that saved this company from bankruptcy court. I didn't do it for the profit. The fundamentals were terrible. I did it because 5 years ago I had just met Vanessa. The room was so quiet you could hear the heartbeat of the man next to me. I loved her." I continued, my voice softening just a fraction. "I knew her father was in trouble. I knew that if the company failed, it would destroy her family. I wanted to protect her. So I used my private capital to save you. I hid behind a blind trust because I didn't want my money to define our relationship. I wanted you to accept me for who I was, not for the check I could write." I stood up slowly, walking around the table until I was standing right next to the screen, the light illuminating my face. "But you never did you? You took the money, but you spit on the man who gave it to you. You saw a laborer, and you treated him like a dog, never realizing that the hand you were biting was the only thing holding you up." Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his composure cracking like dry clay, but he refused to crumble. He looked at the screen displaying his salvation from 5 years ago, and then he looked at the board members trying to find a sympathetic face. He found none. But Richard was a survivor. He was a man who had built a career on bluffs and bullying, and he had one card left to play. "Fine," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "So you own the stock, Mason. Congratulations. You bought a seat at the table. But ownership is not management. You are a factory worker. You don't know the first thing about supply chains or aerospace logistics or government contracts. You can't fire me. I am the only one who knows how this machine works. If you remove me the stock tanks, the company dies. I am the best operator you have, and you know it." He straightened his jacket, trying to regain his physical stature. "You need cause to remove a CEO, he declared, pointing a finger at me. "And you don't have cause. I have delivered record profits for 3 quarters in a row. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my Italian suit. I didn't pull out a legal brief. I didn't pull out a subpoena. I pulled out a clear plastic sandwich bag. Inside was a clump of mangled paper strips carefully taped together with clear Scotch tape. It looked ridiculous sitting on the polished mahogany table. A bag of trash in a room of millions. I found this in your personal shredder yesterday, Richard. I said, my voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. It is amazing what people throw away when they think the janitor is too stupid to read. I slid the bag across the table. It stopped right in front of the representative from the pension fund, a woman known for her ruthlessness. She picked it up, squinting at the reconstructed document through the plastic. Blue Sky Holdings, I said. A consulting firm in the Cayman Islands. You paid them $15 million over the last 18 months. Richard's face turned the color of ash. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I continued, my eyes locking onto his. The problem, Richard, is that Blue Sky Holdings has no employees, no office, no phone number. It is just a bank account. And I am willing to bet my entire 45% stake that if we subpoena the signatory on that account, it will be your mistress. Or maybe you. The room erupted. The pension fund representative threw the bag down like it was contaminated. 15 million, she shouted. We have been cutting employee benefits to save money, and you have been funneling millions offshore. I turned my gaze to Brad. He wasn't shouting. He was slumped in his chair, looking like he was about to vomit. He was staring at the bag of shredded paper with the horror of a man watching his own execution. And Brad, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Your bank just approved a $50 million line of credit based on the financial statements that Richard falsified to hide this theft. That is not just bad banking. That is complicity in wire fraud. You didn't do your due diligence. You just wanted the commission. Brad loosened his tie, gasping for air. I didn't know, he stammered. I swear I didn't know. It doesn't matter what you knew, I said. It matters what you signed. And you signed your own death warrant. The vote was a formality, a ritual sacrifice performed in under 60 seconds. 12 hands went up in favor of the motion. 12 pairs of eyes looked at Richard not with loyalty, but with the cold calculation of survival. They were cutting off the infected limb to save the body. I stood at the head of the table looking down at the man who had sat in this chair for 30 years. He looked small now, shrunken by the weight of his own corruption. Richard Sterling. I said, my voice filling the silence like concrete pouring into a mold. You are hereby removed as CEO effectively immediately. Your security clearance is revoked. Your access to company accounts is terminated. Security will escort you from the building once you have surrendered your keys. Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his face a mask of purple rage. He opened his mouth to scream, to threaten to fire everyone in the room, but he had no voice left. He had no power left. I turned my gaze to Brad. He was shaking so hard his chair was vibrating against the floor. And Brad, I said softly, don't bother calling your office to warn them. My legal team sent the unredacted dossier of your fraudulent loan approvals to the FBI field office at 8 this morning. Agents are likely walking into your bank right now, seizing your servers and your personal hard drive. You aren't just unemployed. You are a federal suspect. Brad let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, the reality of prison bars replacing the vision of his yacht. Richard tried to stand up. He pushed himself up from the table, his eyes bulging. You can't. I built this. Suddenly he stopped. His hand flew to his chest, clutching the silk tie I knew cost $300. His face twisted in agony, a silent scream of sudden crushing pressure. He gasped a wet, rattling sound, and then his legs gave out. He collapsed forward, hitting the mahogany table with a sickening thud before sliding off the chair and onto the floor. It was a moment of pure human tragedy, and yet the reaction of the room was chilling. No one moved. The board members, the people who had drunk his whiskey and laughed at his jokes just moments ago, recoiled. They pulled their chairs back as if Richard were radioactive. They didn't want to be near him. They didn't want to be associated with the fallen king. They watched him gasp for air on the carpet with the detachment of scientists observing a dying specimen. I stood still watching him. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel pity. I just felt the cold finality of cause and effect. Then the double doors burst open. Vanessa ran in, breathless and disheveled. She had been waiting in the outer office, expecting to be called in to witness my execution. Instead, she found a massacre. She saw the board members staring at the floor. She saw me standing tall and untouched at the head of the table, and then she saw him. Dad. The scream tore from her throat, raw and terrified. She rushed past me, ignoring the man she had married, and fell to her knees beside her father. She grabbed his hand, tears streaming down her face, crying out for help in a room full of people who had already moved on. The paramedics wheeled Richard out on a gurney, his face covered by an oxygen mask, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. The board members awkwardly gathered their papers and shuffled out, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the family drama. Finally, it was just the two of us. Vanessa stood in the center of the room. Her white dress was crumpled where she had knelt on the floor. Her mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked like a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life she had torched with her own hands. She looked at the empty chair where her father had sat, and then she slowly lifted her gaze to me. I was still sitting at the head of the table. I hadn't moved. I watched her process the scene. I watched her look at the Italian suit that fit me like a second skin. I watched her look at the confidence in my posture, the absolute authority that radiated from the man she thought was a loser. "You own it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You own Argos Capital. You own everything." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The room spoke for me. Why, she asked, her voice rising, cracking with a mix of hysteria and accusation. "Why didn't you tell me, Mason? We lived in that tiny apartment. I worried about rent. I worried about car payments. And you were sitting on millions. You let me think you were a failure. You let my father humiliate you. You let me humiliate you. Why would you do that to me?" It was classic Vanessa. Even in the face of my vindication, she managed to make herself the victim. She didn't ask if I was okay after being arrested. She didn't apologize for betraying me. She was angry that I hadn't given her the cheat codes to the game she thought she was playing. I stood up slowly and walked around the table until I was standing right in front of her. I didn't reach out. I kept my hands in my pockets. "I was going to tell you, Vanessa," I said, my voice low and devoid of anger. "That night at dinner, I had the papers in my truck. I was going to tell you that I had saved your father's company 5 years ago. I was going to tell you that I did it for you. That I was ready to use my resources to give us a life you couldn't even imagine." She stared at me, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Then why didn't you?" she sobbed. "Because I asked you a question," I said. "I asked you who you loved, and you didn't answer. When your father threw that employment contract on the table when he told me to clean his toilets, you didn't tell him to go to hell. You didn't tell him that your husband deserved respect." I leaned in closer so she could see the cold, hard truth in my eyes. "You told me to take the mop, Vanessa. You told me to say thank you. In that moment I realized you didn't love me. You loved the idea of safety. You loved the sterling name more than you loved the man who carried it with you. You never believed in me. You only believed in what I could provide. And since I was just a janitor in your eyes, I decided to show you exactly what happens when you treat a king like a servant. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, to spin the narrative again, but the weight of my words crushed her. She realized with a terrifying clarity that the checkmate hadn't happened today. It had happened the moment she told me to scrub the floor. The private wing of St. Jude's Hospital usually smelled of fresh lilies and expensive insurance premiums, but today it smelled of antiseptic and impending incarceration. A uniformed police officer sat in a plastic chair outside room 402 reading a sports magazine, his service weapon a dark reminder that the man inside wasn't just a patient, he was a prisoner in waiting. Beatrice was pacing the hallway wearing a Chanel suit that looked like it hadn't been changed in 2 days. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from crying. When she saw me walking down the corridor, the sound of my dress shoes clicking on the linoleum made her jump. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Mason," she gasped, rushing forward to grab my arm. Her grip was weak, trembling. "Thank God you are here. You have to stop this. You have to tell them it was a mistake. He is your father-in-law. He is family." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, the same hand that had swirled a glass of wine while she made jokes about me being unable to pay rent. I didn't shake her off aggressively, I simply removed her hand with a cold detachment, as if removing a piece of lint. "He ceased to be family the moment he tried to frame me for a felony, Beatrice," I said, my voice flat. "And he ceased to be a businessman the moment he embezzled $15 million from my company." "Please," she sobbed, breaking down completely. "He is an old man. His heart is weak. Prison will kill him. You have won, Mason. You have the company. You have the money. Just let him go. Let us retire quietly. We will go away. We will never bother you again." I walked past her to the door. "I am not here to ruin him." "Beatrice," I said, "I am here to give him a choice, which is more than he ever gave me." I nodded to the officer who recognized me from the news reports and stepped aside. I pushed the door open. Richard looked small in the hospital bed. The wires and tubes hooked up to his chest made him look frail, a stark contrast to the tyrant who had screamed at me in the boardroom. But when he opened his eyes and saw me, the hatred was still there, burning dim but steady. "You," he wheezed, his voice raspy under the oxygen mask. "Have you come to gloat?" I pulled a chair over. I didn't sit. I placed it backward and leaned against it, looking down at him. "I don't have time to gloat, Richard. I have a company to fix, a company you broke." I leaned in closer, lowering my voice so the officer outside couldn't hear the specifics of the negotiation. "Here is the situation. The FBI is building a case for wire fraud and embezzlement. With the evidence I gave them, they have you dead to rights. You are looking at 20 years. At your age and with that heart condition that is a death sentence. You will die in a concrete box alone." Richard closed his eyes, a tear leaking out. But I continued, "Because I am a pragmatic man, I am offering you a lifeline. You have $15 million sitting in the Blue Sky account in the Caymans. I want it back. All of it. I don't—" He started to lie, but stopped when he saw my face. "Don't lie to me," I warned. "You have 24 hours to wire the funds back to the operating account. If the ledger balances by noon tomorrow, I will speak to the district attorney. I will tell them that the company has been made whole. I will recommend a plea deal. 5 years in a minimum security facility. You will survive that. You might even get out in 3 for good behavior." Richard stared at the ceiling, weighing his pride against his survival. "And if I don't," he whispered. "If you don't," I stood up, straightening my suit. "Then I will let the law take its full course. I will spend every penny of my dividends ensuring the prosecution has every resource they need to bury you. You will keep the money, but you will never spend it." I turned to the door. Noon tomorrow, Richard. Decide if you want to be a rich corpse or a poor survivor. The glass walls of Brad's corner office at First City Bank were designed to project transparency and power. But on Tuesday morning, they became a display case for his destruction. Brad was frantic. He was shoving documents into a shredder that was already jamming from the volume of incriminating evidence. He was trying to delete emails, trying to wire his liquid cash to a safe haven in Switzerland, but his fingers were slipping on the keyboard because his hands were shaking so violently. He hit enter on a transfer of $200,000. The screen flashed red. Account frozen. Contact federal authorities. Brad stared at the screen, the blood draining from his face. Before he could even scream, the double doors to his office burst open. It wasn't the janitor this time. It was 6 agents from the FBI wearing windbreakers that rustled with the sound of federal indictments. They didn't knock. They didn't ask nicely. Bradford Cole, one of the agents, barked, holding up a badge. "You are under arrest for bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. Step away from the computer." Brad tried to run. It was a pathetic instinct, a reptile brain reaction. He scrambled toward the side door, but they were on him in seconds. They slammed him against the glass wall, the impact audible to the entire trading floor. His employees, the people he had terrorized for years, stopped their work to watch. Some of them pulled out their phones, recording the moment the golden boy turned into a felon. They marched him out through the lobby in handcuffs. The press was waiting outside, alerted by an anonymous tip from a certain lawyer who liked to see justice served cold. The camera flashes were blinding, a strobe light of humiliation, capturing every drop of sweat on Brad's forehead for the evening news. But prison was only the first half of his nightmare. The second half was me. I sat in Bennett's office watching the live feed of the arrest on a large monitor. Bennett walked in holding a thick file. "The bank is trying to distance themselves from him," Bennett said. "They are calling his loans. He is over-leveraged, Mason. He owes $3 million on the penthouse, $200,000 on the Porsche. He is underwater." I looked at the screen, watching Brad try to hide his face from the cameras. "Buy it," I said, taking a sip of coffee. Bennett paused. "Buy what?" "All of it," I said. "Buy the debt. Buy the note on his apartment. Buy the lien on his car. I want to be the one holding the paper. I want to be the one he owes." 2 days later, Brad was released on bail, his parents putting up their retirement home to get him out. He took a taxi back to his luxury penthouse, the only sanctuary he had left. He walked up to the valet stand, expecting to see his silver Porsche waiting for him. It was there. But I was leaning against the hood. Brad stopped dead on the sidewalk. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with exhaustion and rage. "Get away from my car." "Your car?" I asked, holding up a set of keys. "I don't think so. You see, Brad, when the bank called your loan, you defaulted. And since I bought the debt from the bank this morning, this car belongs to Argos Capital." I tossed the keys to a man in coveralls standing next to a tow truck. "Load it up," I said. Brad lunged forward but stopped when he saw the eviction notice I was holding in my other hand. "And don't bother going upstairs, Brad," I said, my voice cold. "I own the mortgage on the penthouse, too. You missed your payment today. I am foreclosing. The locks have already been changed. Your clothes are in a box in the lobby." Brad stood on the street corner, stripped of his car, his home, and his dignity. He looked at me, and for the first time he realized that he hadn't just lost a game. He had been owned by the player he never bothered to respect. The iron gates of the Silver Creek estate swung open silently, recognizing the license plate of the car I had sent to pick her up. Vanessa didn't drive herself. She sat in the back of the black town car, her face pressed against the glass, watching the winding driveway climb higher and higher above the city smog. When the trees cleared, revealing the house, she gasped. It wasn't just a mansion. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, glass and steel cantilevered over the canyon edge, a monument to the kind of wealth she had only ever read about in magazines. I was waiting for her at the front door. I wasn't wearing a suit today. I was wearing a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, the casual uniform of a man who doesn't need to impress anyone. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the imported slate of the driveway. She looked at the house, then at the McLaren parked in the garage, and finally at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of awe and devastating regret. "Mason," she breathed, walking toward me, her hands reaching out. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I didn't take her hands. I stepped back, inviting her inside with a gesture. "Come in, Vanessa. There is something I want to show you." She followed me into the foyer, her eyes darting around, taking in the 20-foot ceilings, the original artwork on the walls, the panoramic view of the skyline. She started crying, soft, desperate tears. "I was so stupid," she sobbed. "But you have to understand, Mason. Dad forced me. He told me you were a criminal. I was scared. I never stopped loving you. I got lost. We can fix this. Now that I know the truth, we can be the power couple we were meant to be." I stopped walking and turned to face her. "You think the money is the truth?" I asked softly. "No, Vanessa. The money is just the scenery." I opened a set of double doors to the left. "Look." She looked inside and her hand flew to her mouth. It was an art studio. North-facing windows for perfect light, easels made of hand-carved oak shelves stocked with the finest paints from Paris. It was the studio she had always dreamed of, the one she talked about when we were dating, before she decided that being a socialite was more important than being an artist. "I built this for you," I said, watching her crumble. "I designed it while I was working double shifts at the factory. I bought the supplies with my first dividend check. I wanted to surprise you on our anniversary." I closed the door, shutting away the dream. I led her down the hall to the master suite. It was vast, warm, and inviting. On the bedside table was a framed photo of us from 5 years ago, before the bitterness set in. "This was supposed to be our sanctuary," I said. "A place where the sterling name didn't matter. A place where we could just be Mason and Vanessa." She fell to her knees on the plush carpet, reaching for my hand. "We can still have this," she pleaded, her mascara running. "Please, Mason, give me a chance. I will be the best wife. I will make it up to you. I love you." I looked down at her. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was the sadness of mourning a death, not the hope of resurrection. "You love the house, Vanessa," I said, my voice gentle but final. "You love the lifestyle. You love the safety. But you don't love the man. Because when the man was wearing coveralls and driving a rusted truck, you were ashamed of him. You threw him to the wolves to save your own skin." I pulled my hand away and walked to the front door, holding it open. The town car was still waiting, engine running. "This house isn't a home, Vanessa. It is a museum of what could have been. And you don't live here anymore." She stood up, shaky and pale. She looked at me one last time, searching for a crack in the armor, but finding only smooth, cold steel. She walked out the door, her shoulders slumped, carrying the crushing weight of everything she had thrown away for nothing. "Goodbye, Vanessa," I said, closing the heavy door. The lock clicked, and for the first time in 5 years, I was truly free. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and expensive cologne, a sterile scent that failed to mask the stench of desperation. Vanessa sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a team of lawyers who charged by the minute. She looked confident. Her tears from the hospital and the villa had dried, replaced by the cold, hard calculation of a woman who realized that if she couldn't have love, she would take the money. Her lead attorney, a man with a smile like a razor blade, stood up to address the judge. "Your Honor." He began pacing the floor. "The facts are simple. Mr. Reed accumulated his wealth during the course of the marriage. The law is clear. This is community property. My client is entitled to 50% of all assets, including the holdings of Argos Capital. We are asking for an equitable distribution of $1.5 billion. Vanessa looked at me across the aisle. There was a flicker of triumph in her eyes. She thought she had me trapped. She thought that the law was a calculator, and she was about to press the equals button on a $700 million payout. She believed she deserved it payment for the years she spent embarrassed by my blue-collar disguise. I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. Beside me, Bennett Ross slowly closed his laptop. He didn't look worried. He looked bored. Bennett stood up, smoothing the front of his suit. He didn't have a team of lawyers. He didn't need one. He walked to the bench carrying a single document protected by a plastic sleeve. "Your Honor," Bennett said, his voice calm and resonant. "While opposing counsel's understanding of community property is generally correct, he has neglected a crucial piece of evidence. A document signed by Mrs. Reed 5 years ago." Bennett placed the document on the judge's bench and handed a copy to Vanessa's lawyer. Vanessa frowned. She leaned over to look at the paper. Her eyes scanned the header, and her face went pale. "Do you recognize this signature?" Mrs. Reed, Bennett asked, turning to face her. Yes," she stammered. "It is the prenuptial agreement. But that was to protect my assets." Bennett smiled a thin, predatory smile. "Exactly," Bennett said. "When you married Mr. Reed, you were under the impression that he was destitute. You insisted on a strict separation of assets. You wanted to ensure that if you divorced, the poor mechanic couldn't touch your father's money." He turned to the judge. "If you will look at Clause 7, Section B, Your Honor. It states clearly that any assets held in separate trusts or acquired through independent investment vehicles prior to or during the marriage remain the sole property of the original holder." It was a clause Mrs. Reed's own lawyers drafted to protect the Sterling inheritance. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading the text. He looked up at Vanessa. Bennett continued driving the nail into the coffin. "My client, Mason Reed, founded Argos Capital 5 years ago and placed it in a blind trust. According to the contract, Vanessa signed a contract she insisted on. She has no claim to the trust. Not 1 cent. Vanessa grabbed the paper from her lawyer's hands. She stared at the words, the legal jargon she had barely skimmed 5 years ago because she was so arrogant, so sure that I was nothing. She had built a fortress to keep me out, never realizing she was locking herself out of the treasury, but... She whispered, "This isn't fair. I didn't know he was rich. If I had known..." "If you had known, you wouldn't have signed it," Bennett finished for her. "But you did sign it. You wanted to protect yourself from a gold digger, Mrs. Reed, and in doing so, you protected the gold from yourself." The judge slammed the gavel down, a sound like a gunshot. "The court upholds the prenuptial agreement. The plaintiff's request for asset division is denied. The marriage is dissolved. Each party retains their own assets." Case closed. Vanessa sat frozen as the reality washed over her. She wasn't getting half. She wasn't getting millions. She was leaving this marriage exactly as she had entered it, with nothing but her arrogance. I stood up, buttoning my jacket. I didn't look back at her. I walked out of the courtroom, leaving her alone with the expensive lawyers she could no longer afford to pay. The fluorescent lights of the boutique buzzed with a low, constant drone that felt like it was drilling into my skull. My feet were throbbing. I had been standing for 6 hours in cheap heels that pinched my toes, a stark contrast to the designer stilettos I used to wear when I walked into this same store as a VIP client. Now I was just the girl who folded the sweaters. I was the girl who fetched the sizes. I was the invisible help. "Excuse me, miss," a customer snapped, snapping her fingers in front of my face. She was a woman I recognized from the country club, a woman I used to play tennis with. She didn't recognize me. Or maybe she did, and she just enjoyed the power dynamic. Do you have this blouse in a medium? And hurry up. I have a lunch reservation. I forced a smile, a plastic expression that felt like it was cracking my face. Right away, ma'am. I walked to the front counter to check the inventory computer. My hands were dry from handling fabric all day. I felt hollow. It had been a year since the trial. A year since the gavel banged down and shattered my life. Dad was serving year 1 of a 5-year sentence in a minimum security facility in Nevada. Mom had moved to a small condo in Florida, living off Social Security and bitterness. And I was here scanning barcodes and eating lunch out of a Tupperware container. That was when I saw it. It was sitting on the counter next to a display of silk scarves, a copy of Forbes magazine. The cover was glossy, catching the overhead light, but it wasn't the glare that blinded me. It was the face. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, turning into a sharp, painful hiccup. Mason. He was standing in front of a sleek jet engine, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't wearing the blue jumpsuit. He wasn't even wearing the suit from the courtroom. He was wearing a casual black blazer open at the collar, looking relaxed, powerful, and devastatingly handsome. The headline screamed in bold gold letters, "The Titan of Industry, How Mason Reed Saved American Aerospace." I reached out my hand, trembling so badly I almost knocked over a bottle of perfume. I touched the cool paper. I traced the line of his jaw. He looked older. There were fine lines around his eyes, lines of wisdom and hard-won battles. But his eyes were clear. They were bright. They were happy. I flipped the page. The article detailed his empire, the acquisition of rival firms, the charitable foundation he had started for underprivileged engineering students, the billions he had added to the economy. And then a quote caught my eye. When asked about his motivation for success, Mr. Reed smiled. "I learned the hard way that you have to build your own value," he said. "You can't rely on anyone else to see your worth. Sometimes you have to let the people who doubt you watch from the sidelines while you change the world." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was the people who doubted him. I was the sideline. The store faded away. The buzzing lights, the rude customers, the smell of expensive fabric, it all disappeared. All I could see was the small apartment where we used to live. The nights he came home tired, and I wouldn't look at him. The way I pulled my hand away when he tried to touch me because I smelled grease on his skin. I had held a diamond in my hand and threw it away because I thought it was a rock. A tear splashed onto the glossy page, warping the paper right over his heart. Then another. Then a sob broke loose, a ragged, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet shop. "Hey, are you okay?" the manager asked, walking over, her voice annoyed. "You are crying on the merchandise, Vanessa. Pull it together." I looked up at her, tears streaming down my face, blurring the image of the husband I had betrayed. "I can't," I whispered, clutching the magazine to my chest. "I made a mistake. I made such a terrible mistake." I sank to the floor right there behind the counter, surrounded by the trappings of a wealth I could no longer touch, weeping for the love I had sold for nothing. The wind on the roof was different than the wind on the street. Down below it smelled of exhaust and desperate ambition, but up here, 70 stories above the concrete, it was clean and cold and sharp. I stood at the edge of the parapet, watching the city lights flicker on like a galaxy of artificial stars. Below me on the facade of the building, a team of industrial climbers was finishing their work. The giant neon letters that had spelled Sterling Dynamics for 30 years were gone. In their place, shining in a deep, steady cobalt blue, was the new name, Reed Dynamics. It wasn't just a rebranding, it was a reclaiming. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel the crushing weight of having to hide who I was. I didn't have to wear the mask of the fool or the disguise of the janitor. I was just Mason. I heard the heavy steel door open behind me, followed by the soft click of heels on the gravel roof. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was by the rhythm of her walk, steady and unpretentious. Sarah stepped up beside me. She wasn't wearing a ball gown or dripping in diamonds. She was wearing her work coat, wrapped tight against the chill, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed one to me. "Black 2 sugars," she said. "Just the way you like it." I took the cup, my fingers brushing hers. "Thank you, Sarah." She looked out at the city, the wind catching strands of her hair. She had been there from the beginning, in her own quiet way. She was the paralegal who had organized the files Bennett used to destroy Brad. But more importantly, she was the only person in this entire building who had shown me kindness when I was wearing the blue jumpsuit. I remembered that day in the conference room. Richard had poured the coffee on the floor. Brad had laughed. Vanessa had looked away. But Sarah, who had been taking notes in the corner, had walked over when they left. She hadn't looked at me with pity. She had looked at me with respect. She had handed me a stack of napkins and whispered that I didn't deserve to be treated that way. She didn't know I was a billionaire. She just saw a human being. "You did it, Mason," she said softly, looking up at the glowing blue sign. "You actually did it. You took it all back." I took a sip of the coffee. The warmth spread through my chest. "We took it back," I corrected her. "I couldn't have done the legal heavy lifting without you. Bennett is the shark, but you are the one who steers him." She smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her eyes. It was so different from Vanessa's calculated camera-ready smiles. "So what happens now?" she asked. "The revenge is over. The bad guys are in jail or bankrupt. The company is yours. What does Mason Reed do tomorrow morning?" I turned to face her. I looked at the woman who had valued the janitor as much as she valued the CEO. "Tomorrow," I said, "I start building. No more secrets. No more games. Just good work with good people." I looked back at the skyline one last time. I thought about the mop bucket. I thought about the stained carpets and the shredded paper. I thought about the humiliation that had forged me into something harder, something sharper. "You know, Sarah," I said, my voice low and reflective, "people looked down on me when I held that mop. They thought cleaning was beneath them, but they were wrong." I looked at her and then at the pristine city below us, the world finally making sense. Sometimes, I said, a small smile playing on my lips, "you have to clear away the trash before you can finally see the diamond." I finished my coffee and tossed the empty cup into the bin by the door. I offered my arm to Sarah. "Come on, let's go home." She took my arm and together we walked away from the edge, leaving the cold wind behind, stepping into the warmth of the future. The journey of Mason Reed teaches us a powerful lesson about perception and reality. True value is never found in a bank account or a designer suit, but in the integrity we hold when we think no one is watching. Vanessa and Richard were so blinded by their arrogance that they mistook a diamond for broken glass simply because it was covered in dust. They learned too late that how you treat the janitor says more about your character than how you treat the CEO. Never judge a book by its cover, because you never know who is really writing the story. If you enjoyed seeing justice served and the underdog win, don't forget to like and follow for more incredible stories.